Well, it looks like Mickey's little hand is pointed straight up, so I think we are ready to get started. Uh, as I open this up, I mentioned we took the summer off, meaning, of course, webinar-wise. We've actually had a quite busy summer, and we are looking forward to getting back into the webinar scene. We've got one today focused on PolyBase and looking at external data. So without taking up more of his time, I'll turn it over to Scott Klein and he will get us started.
All right. Well, thanks, Jason, and good. I was going to say good day, but that doesn't apply because it's nighttime for Dan. So I'll introduce Dan in a minute, but I was going to say good day. But welcome everybody to this webinar. As Jason alluded to, my name is Scott Klein. I'll introduce myself in a minute, but this webinar is stemming from, we're basically going to talk about PolyBase and data integration, and I'll introduce myself and get to the agenda in a second, but really this webinar stems from several of our clients have come to us and said, hey, we need X. We need to do, some data archival stuff, or we need, we've got some link server. We need to improve performance on data integration. How do we do that? And so in working with all of that, we thought, well, these guys have 2000, a lot of our clients have 2012, 2014, 2017, 19, right? Things, across the spectrum, and a lot of our clients aren't aware of PolyBase or they don't know how to use it. So we thought, hey, let's do a webinar on kind of data integration using PolyBase. And so that's what we're going to focus on today, but really focusing on a couple key areas, and we'll get to that in a second with the agenda. But let me introduce myself really quick. So like Jason said, I'm Scott Klein. I'm a senior consultant here at SQL Solutions Group. I've been doing SQL Server for a long time, right? I got started with SQL Server 6. Actually, I think I got a taste of SQL Server 4.2 at the very end, right before 6 came out. So I remember that and the floppies, right? Prior to coming to SSG, I've been here at SSG for, just hit my 3-year anniversary. So prior to that, I was at Microsoft for about 8 or so years as a data platform evangelist. So I covered SQL Server, the Azure Data Platform, all of that stuff. Had a great time, but wanted to get working with real clients. So I came to SSG and having a blast. So enough about me. Let's talk about who SSG is, and then we'll get into the agenda and the meat of the webinar. So SQL Solutions Group, I think it's been around, 11 years now or so. Founded by Randy Knight, who I think is attending this webinar. He's a Microsoft MCM, Microsoft Certified Master, and we have clients throughout the United States in all types of industries. And Randy likes to call it, and I agree with it, we're kind of a boutique consultancy, right? We offer SQL coaching, we offer remote DBA services, full scope project consulting services, and we even do health checks. We will go in and do a full stack health check to look to see, hey, where are your performance issues? What's going on with your environment? So we offer a kind of a broad range of services, and we love what we do. So enough about us. Let's get into what we're going to talk about today. So what I want to do is kind of get an idea of, how anybody, for those that are watching, kind of your background in PolyBase. So if you want to just put in the chat, hey, you've never heard of it, I'm a beginner, I've used it, I helped write the thing, whatever, if you can put in there what you've done, and Jason, let me know what kind of the responses are. But kind of want to get an idea of everybody's, experience with PolyBase, because that'll kind of give me an idea of how we want to talk about some of the topics here. But what I want to do is really start with introducing PolyBase, because what we're finding in a lot of areas, it's almost like Query Store. We did a Query Store presentation not long ago, and people almost don't know it's there, right? Oh, what's PolyBase, right? And we're finding that Query Store is the same thing. What's Query Store? What's PolyBase, right? And PolyBase has been around since 2016, right? And so I want to build the foundation of this presentation and this webinar, kind of introducing PolyBase and what it is and what it does, kind of some of the features and functionality. And then what we're going to get to is really the meat of why we decided to do this webinar and talk about PolyBase versus linked servers and the differences between those, performance differences between those, what you need to look for. Because, and when I would get to that section, there's some background I want to provide in there, but we're really going to spend a lot of time there. And when we get to that, so I'm going to, and part of that is I'm going to have Dan Manley, who's on our team, introduce himself, because he and I spent a lot of time looking at this. So Dan, why don't you take a second to introduce yourself, and then we'll keep going.
Yeah, hi, my name's Daniel Manley. Scott was making a joke about how it's not a good day for everybody. I recently moved over out of the country, so it's 2 a.m. where I'm at. So, but I'm having a good night, Scott. So thanks.
Yeah. So everybody, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been working with SQL Server probably about 9-10 years coming up now. I started on SQL 2000, 2005, 2008 were my main ones. And yeah, I've done work and helped out and such with SQL Solutions Group and yeah, I focus on a lot of the performance tuning optimization and then also some of the configuration stuff for SQL Server. So absolutely love it.
Yep. So everybody give a round of applause for Dan, because it is 2 a.m. where he's at, and he's stayed up to kind of help out with this PolyBase and link server. Because Dan and I spend a lot of time, looking at this and working on this, and we'll explain more about that when we get to that. But kudos to Dan for helping out. And then I really want to, spend some time talking about PolyBase and the non-relational side, right? Querying, because PolyBase can query SQL Server, PolyBase can query relational, but it can also query non-relational, unstructured data. And so I want to spend some time talking about that, how to do that, scenarios around that, and then we'll wrap up from there. All right. So what is PolyBase? So like I said, PolyBase has been around since SQL Server 2016, and really what it is, it's a distributed compute engine. It's integrated right in with SQL Server and allows you to query all sorts of different data sources. So using ODBC, so I can query Excel, I can query NoSQL, like Azure Blob Storage or Cosmos DB or Microsoft SQL, relational databases, or even big data. And big data really was kind of the driving force behind PolyBase to begin with, right? So when I was at Microsoft, one of the big things that they were pushing was, they did Hadoop, right? Which was, they had licensed Hortonworks and we're offering that as a service. But hey, I've got all this data, distributed out there in different formats, but I don't want to have to pull it in and do something with it. So can I query it where it's at, right? And so we think about, one of the main goals of PolyBase was really to reduce the need of ETL. So if we think about it, PolyBase equals data virtualization equals the reduced need for ETL, right? One of the main tenets for PolyBase is to provide distributed read scale performance, right? So if you think about big data, right, Hadoop it's a multi-node scenario where I'm distributing my workload across many nodes, right? Well, if I can take SQL Server and query that and push a query across, hey, I want to query all this data and distribute that across all the Hadoop nodes, bring the results back, boom, right, without doing all this ETL stuff. So it's really a distributed compute engine right into SQL Server, right? When you install SQL Server, one of the options is, hey, install PolyBase, okay? I mentioned this, the whole goal is to say, hey, I don't want to have to, let's reduce ETL, right? Query the data where it's at, right? Whether it's in, Azure, whether it's in, like Excel or Hadoop or Oracle, whatever, query it where it's at. I want to execute a query, write a T-SQL statement, execute that statement, have it pushed down to where the data resides, and then bring the data back, right? So again, reduce the need for ETL. Query the data where it's at, and it does a great job of that, right? If I want to if I'm doing a more, I'll call it complex scenario where, hey, I got it, it's a distributed environment, and we call it in there in the first bullet point, right? Distributed compute engine, right? So I can distribute my queries across multiple nodes if I need to, right? So even with SQL Server, I can spin up multiple SQL servers and have that be multiple compute nodes. We're not going to do that today. That's probably a different webinar, right? But today we're going to focus on simple, but hey, I can distribute my workload across many nodes to improve the performance of my query. And that's awesome. Really love that. I can, it's a manual deploy, right? But it can also be, right? So it's an initial manual deploy, but I can also auto deploy that with big data clusters, right? And so we will talk briefly about that. We're really not going to get into the big data scenario or talk about big data clusters, but we'll kind of touch on that just briefly. But this is what PolyBase is all about, right? Can we eliminate the need for ETL, improve our query performance by distributing that across many nodes, and make it easy to query data where it's at, right? And that was what PolyBase is all about, right? So if we think about, and it's I mentioned this, it's all about data virtualization, right? So let's think about PolyBase as a semantic layer, right? So what it does is, and we'll see this in the next slide and in the demo, right? What it does is it creates an external table that maps to the source data, whether it's a flat file, whether it's another SQL table or Hadoop or whatever, right? Create an external table that maps to that data, right? The great thing about this, and we'll talk about this, Dan and I will talk about this more when we get into some of the demos, it's we can obfuscate some of the data that we don't want to bring back, right? So if a table's got 10 columns, but we only want to see 5, we can exclude 5 of those columns and just create our external table on those 5 columns that we want to see, or just the data that we want to see, right? Where we really can't do that with linked servers, right? So there's great security around just, to be able to obfuscate some of that data, right? We'll talk about joins and data source access here in a little bit, but another great thing about PolyBase is, and I've got a quick demo about this, is we can actually use views, SQL Server views, to abstract some of that data as well, right? On some of the data sources. So we'll see that in a quick demo here in a minute, right? And then we have, just like since it's SQL Server, you can use joins and unions to collect and gather that data and query all sorts of data, right? So if I want to union and join data from different data sources, I can do that right through PolyBase because it uses the T-SQL language. So it's phenomenal. It doesn't matter where my data sits, I can do that. I can query different data sources and union and join those together right through T-SQL, right? Jason, do we have any results yet from that question I asked?
Yes, indeed. Quite a mix. Rob said, "What is PolyBase?" Which is what your first slide said. Yep. Lee, he wrote a blog on PolyBase about querying AS400 when PolyBase first came out.
Dang, so, Lee, that's hardcore, buddy. Oh my goodness.
And then Heimstadt, they're transitioning to SQL 2019, and so they'll be using PolyBase, and yeah.
Okay, good. Well, for those that aren't querying AS400, hopefully this is beneficial. Lee, you and I need to talk. That's awesome. That's awesome. Querying AS400. All right, so let's keep going. All right, so at a high level, I want to walk through what it takes to implement and configure PolyBase, right? And it's all about the external table, but I want to walk through the steps it takes to use PolyBase at a high level, right? Because that'll help us understand some of the demos that we go through, okay? Now, so step 1, set up and configure PolyBase. Now, it says, I'm going to caveat this right at the beginning, it says, not simple without BDC, right? But I'm going to caveat that on this first step, right? BDC, I mentioned this earlier, stands for big data clusters. And I know it says it's not simple, but it can be, right? If you're doing distributed, then you absolutely need big data clusters to create that distributed scale out group to get that performance, right? But I'm going to show you in my demos, hey, it's almost install and go, right? And the reason, again, big data clusters, if you need to do big distributed stuff, like you're querying Hadoop and a big Hadoop cluster, then you would need like a big data cluster, right? And if you need that big data cluster solves that and makes that deployment easy. But I don't want to scare everybody and say, hey, it's not that hard either, right? And I'm going to walk you through how to do that. So don't take that as, oh my goodness, I need big data clusters. No, set up and configure PolyBase, depending on what you're doing, can be pretty easy. Okay. So set up and configure, set up authorization. This is really, depending on what you're doing, it's a login and password, right? Especially if you're just querying SQL Server or even Azure, basically it's a login and password scenario, right? So you set that up. Create your external data source, and that external data source, we'll walk through a couple of examples. That could be that whole slide we saw a few minutes ago. Is it Excel? Is it SQL Server, Oracle? Is it Azure Blob Storage? What is it? You're basically saying, hey, here's my external data source, right? It's just a pointer to go, there's my data, right? And then at that point, you're going, all right, well, I've got my external data source. Now I'm going to create an external file format. This is only necessary if you're querying a non-relational source, right? Because the external file format is going to say, and I have a demo for this. I may have a CSV out there, right? And I got to tell SQL Server, hey, this is the file format for this CSV, right? So I create the external data source. If I'm doing a non-relational structure, then I got to go, hey, here's my file format. Here's the file format of the data that I want to query, right? So I got to tell it that. And then I create the external table, and I reference the external data source and the file format if necessary. And what I've got now is this table structure, and all it is metadata. It's just a wrapper. I mean, it's not in SQL Server, it doesn't hold the data. It's just metadata. It's a pointer to the data, wherever that data is. So the CSV in Azure Blob Storage or Amazon S3 or whatever, it's just a pointer. So that table is just metadata, right? So I create the external table, and whether I'm doing an external data source or an external file format, I do have to create the external table in either scenario, right? And we're going to talk about this, and this is what Dan and I spent the last 2 days on going, ugh, how do we really understand this? Or, how do we work with this, right? We can create statistics on key columns in that external table, and we're going to walk through that, okay? And then, like any other table, we query it like any other table, SQL Server table. Select star from, select column from, join, to table, union, whatever, right? It's beautiful. Join any other table, and I can join a SQL Server table to an external table. Lovely, right? Makes it nice, right? If I'm querying like Microsoft, Oracle, the results are streamed to SQL Server. It's awesome, right? Do you have any questions about this? Post them in the chat, and Jason can get to that. We'll get to those, but hopefully this makes sense, right? So depending on, regardless of whether you're querying relational or non-relational, these are the steps, right? The only difference is if I'm querying a relational or non-relational, I have to create the external file format, but that's it, right? Pretty sweet. All right. Before we get into the demo, I want to talk about what we can actually talk to, right? And what's available, right? Because I don't want to say, hey, you can do everything with everything, and that'd be a lie, right? So what this slide here, and I basically copy paste from the Microsoft documentation, you can see that online, but just want to cover it here, right? These are the external, left column is the external data sources we can query. They made changes, and the reason we're talking about this is because they made changes in SQL Server 2022 that they actually removed SQL Server 2022 does not support Hadoop anymore. So I don't know if anybody on the call is going to, wants to query Hadoop, but it's not available in SQL Server 2022, right? And I will say, when I was at Microsoft and PolyBase first came out, you couldn't query SQL Server with it, right? That I think came out in SQL Server 2017 or not even 19, right? It wasn't available, but you can do that now. You can query SQL Server. And we'll explain more about this shortly, but one of the gotchas, I'm gonna call it a gotcha, but one of the things that we can see here is that, if I'm doing SQL Server, it's read only. So even if I query an external table, hopefully they'll fix this, because I think this is, I don't know why they didn't do this, but I can only read to an external table. I can't say insert into external table, right? Which would be a challenge, but I can do that with Hadoop, right? If I'm doing a flat file, I can do that. So this explains what the external. This shows what the external data sources are. Can I read or read write to any of these? And can I use SQL Server or Azure Synapse Analytics or things like that? We're not going to get any of those, but hopefully this explains, depending on what you're querying, what your functionality is, whether you can read or write to that, right? So, all right, with that, so my first demo, what I want to do is get to just a really quick introduction to PolyBase, right? So what I have here is two things. So I have on my local laptop, I have SQL Server 2019. And then on a VM on my laptop, I actually have SQL Server 2022. And in this SQL Server 2022 instance, I downloaded the Stack Overflow database and installed that. And I also have this for this first demo. I created a simple database, and I have a table here called Homies. And it's a simple table. It's got 5 users in it, right? Randy, Rich, Warwick, and Jason. These are all SSG people, right? And so I want to be able to say, hey, how do I query that using PolyBase, right? So the first thing I need to do is, and I'm assuming, I'm going to pull up my services here. I thought I had it already. Yep. PolyBase is not installed by default when you install SQL Server. So this is an option to say, when you install SQL Server, make sure that you select PolyBase. Now, there's several options in there. When you select PolyBase, it's going to say, hey, is this going to be a standalone PolyBase node, or is this part of a cluster, right? If you're just, doing simple stuff, you don't need to install the big data stuff. Just to say, yep, this is a standalone instance, and you're good to go, right? So make sure you select that. And then what it does, it selects and installs these two services here, right? SQL Server PolyBase Data Movement and the PolyBase Engine. Both of those must be running. Okay, that's step one.
I want to touch on one thing real quick on that, Scott. That's been a big gotcha for me. Is if you already are running a RTM version of SQL Server, so you've already patched it, which I hope everybody here is doing. You will need to then. The only way I've found to get it working, and I'm mostly doing all my work on 2019, is I install PolyBase. Usually, I still only have an OEM disk or an RTM disk. Or ISO, I guess is what it is now. And after I install that, I reboot I bounce the SQL Server service and run the patch. So you'll take the CU and such like that and rerun your CU for your version of SQL Server, and then that updates. That'll say, hey, I have PolyBase that I need to update and get that done. You'll see some very weird errors. You'll see data sources corrupted or blah blah blah, and you're like, what is going on? And even some of the T-SQL statements might not work. So make sure if you do install PolyBase after you've gotten SQL Server installed, that you also then repatch and rerun your CU.
Yeah, I've seen it too, and that's a good call out. Thank you. I've seen it too, where you'll start these services and it'll error and fill up. It'll start dumping logs and fill up that happened to me a couple years ago. It just filled up my hard drive because it was dumping logs PolyBase, right? So that's a good point. And the fix was patch. If I remember right, it was patch it. So good call out. Yeah, okay. So once I have
and
that,
the one other thing to notice on your screen.
yep.
Sorry, one more thing, Scott. Leave the service account to the default. I have had issues trying to create a Active Directory domain account. Leave it as the network service account.
Yeah.
It works fine, and I don't have issues. Can you make it work with a domain account? Maybe, but leave it alone.
Yeah, and I've never tried to change it. So yeah, good point. All right, so even though I've installed it and I've got these services running, there's one thing you have to do. And if I go to here, we just open a new query window. You basically, it's installed, but by default, if I do execute sp configure and run that, right? PolyBase enabled, right? By default, that's still, even though you install it and even though it's running, this is still 0. So you basically have to go and say, hey, turn this to 1, because that tells SQL Server, okay, I'm using PolyBase. So if PolyBase isn't working for you, you can't get to work, check this, right? That has to be a value of 1, okay? Once you've done that, you are ready to go. And so what I'm going to do is walk through a very simple demo. So close that. No. Okay. So I've got, if anybody wants these scripts, let me know. I can send them to you, but this is really taken from the online docs anyway, up here. So, all right. So you still need a couple things, and you need a master key first. So you can do, hey, create master encryption key. You got that. That's at the instance level. And then at the database level, you got to do a couple things. You have to create a database scoped credential, because that is used creating your external data source, right? In this scenario, I am querying SQL Server, so this must be SQL Auth. Windows Auth is not supported yet for SQL Server. So if I'm querying, in this scenario, I'm querying this SQL Server instance to this SQL Server instance, you've got to go create a SQL Server login, and there's my SQL Server login down there, and then give it the password, right? And there's my password. Okay, so that's my database scope credential, right? Once I have that, I'm ready to go. Okay, so like I said in that slide, the next step is to create the external data source. Okay, since this is a SQL Server instance, you're basically saying SQL Server, and there's the instance name and the port it's running on. Okay, I'm not going to run this because I already did, because I can't delete the external data source because I already have tables that are attached to that, so I can't delete it. But right, so I've got the database scope credential, I've got the external data source, external resources, external data sources. There it is. There's my external data source. Okay, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say, hey, I want to query this table, right? And this table is super simple. It's only got 2 columns. Okay, homie ID and homie name. Okay, so I'm going to create it, call it homie's, my external table is going to be called external homie's external. I want all the columns, and there's the table I want to query. So it's basically going to point to that table and then use this data source. Okay, so I'm going to create that.
Yep. Just to real quick, go over it, Scott, while you're having some of these run.
Yep.
Break it down that we're working with 2 different servers, and I think you kind of showed it, but we've got the 2019 server here that you're mainly running your queries from, and we've got our other server, the external server, is a 2022 server.
Yeah, I mentioned that earlier. Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And so that's going to come into play.
It.
That's going to come into play when we get into the link server one, right?
Okay.
All right. Was there something else you wanted to bring up?
No, not at this point.
Okay, good. Cool. All right, cool. All right, so I've got mine. I now have my, what did I create? So if I refresh my external tables, refresh, there's homie's external. Now, I mentioned earlier too that, what PolyBase allows you to do is obfuscate some data. Say, hey, I got a table of 10 columns, but I only want to expose 5 columns, for example, in this table. So I'm going to create another external table, but only list the homie name table, right? So I'm going to execute that. That's going to be pretty quick, right? So now I'm going to query these 2 tables, right? So I'm going to query those 2 tables. Refresh this. right? There you go. So I've got, there's my query from home is external, and there's my query from home is external too, right? Now we also mentioned too that, hey, I can expose a view. So over on my, I'll call it destination, right? I've got a view, and there's my homies view, and it's just, I think, select star from homies, right? Is my, right? So I'm going to create that, and I'm going to create that external table, and it shows up as an external table, right? So refresh that. There's my homies external view. Now let me just query the, right? So there you go. And as I mentioned before, we could, if we wanted to, if I had another table, I could probably join, I could say, hey, select star from homies external, you know, inner join, you know, so these are, I've got these local tables. I could say inner join badges on, you know, if they had relation columns, right? Or, you know, primary foreign key columns. I could do that, right? All right, so super simple example, but, you know, when that's why I said at the one slide, I said, hey, you know, is the setup and configuration hard? No, it doesn't have to be. If you're just doing a standalone instance and want to query SQL Server, for example, there you go, right? It was create the, you know, install SQL Server or include PolyBase in the install, make sure the services are running, make sure the SP configure that value is set to 1, and then just create the appropriate sources here, and you're all done, right? So it's as simple as that, okay? So that was a very simple introduction to PolyBase, but hopefully shows you you know, how easy it is really to use PolyBase, okay? All right, let's go back to the slides because we got only 28 minutes left. We've got a lot to cover. All right, so this is where Dan and I spend a lot of time. And so I'm going to caveat, let me provide some background, right? So in this scenario, right, we're just going to talk about querying SQL Server, okay? And what we set out to do, so, and again, at this point, I'm going to throw this slide up again and say, hey, in this scenario, since we're querying SQL Server, we don't need the external file format, and you saw that in the demo. We don't need that, but it's the same thing, right? We're just creating an external data source. You saw that, create the external table. We didn't create statistics on that column, but we're going to talk, that's what Dan and I are going to talk about, right? And let me back the bus up here, because when we started down this path, and I'm going to take a couple minutes to explain this. When we started down this path, you know, like I said, we had a couple clients going, hey, we want to, you know, we've got linked servers, is PolyBase an option? And most of us have been around a long time to know that linked servers are notoriously slow, right? Because when you execute a query, it basically says, hey, select star from, right? It brings all the data, goes to the source, grabs the data, brings it back, and then does the unions, joins, sorts, all that kind of stuff, right? So it's notoriously slow, right? So when we got into this, we thought, well, let's talk about linked servers and PolyBase and prove that PolyBase is actually faster. So Dan and I spent quite a bit of time the last few days looking into this, and what we're going to demo is that may or may not be the case. And so, because what we found is, and we'll get into this, is that, you know, older versions, yeah, but newer versions, we had all these demos lined up, and it's like, hey, linked servers was actually faster in 2019, right? And so what we want to do in these demos is get into that. But the reason we got into this is because, hey, let's do a comparison, because if we thought, hey, in this scenario, linked servers is slow, so PolyBase must be faster, right? And we're going to get into that, right? And so this is why, you know, Dan's on, is because we're going to kind of show you what happens when you query a link, you know, use linked server, use the exact same query, but over a linked server versus PolyBase, and what happens, okay? So I don't want to spend a lot of time looking at linked servers. This is really, too far. Everybody knows linked servers, right? It basically, hey, I'm going to basically establish a connection to some other SQL Server instance somewhere, right? And then that allows me to execute commands like, you know, select up to whatever to that source, right? This is supported in SQL Server and Azure SQL Managed Instance, right? But we all know that, right? I've got a client, I'm going to create a link server, and I'm going to use that down the road, right? I want to query that instance, okay? Before we get into the demo, I got a couple slides that I want to talk about the differences between external tables and link servers. I don't want to spend a lot of time on there because I want to get into the demos, the demos, but we saw this earlier, right? When I create a link server, that link server is scoped at the instance level, right? That means as you saw in the demo, external tables are database scoped, right? I create them in the database I'm working with, right? One of the downsides, I think, to PolyBase, unless I'm using HDF, HDFS and going to Hadoop or something, is that it's run only, right? And I think that's a limitation. Hopefully they'll fix that. But if I'm doing link server, I can do read and write, right? One of the great things about external tables is push down. I'll talk. The next slide is about push down computations, right? We'll talk about that a little bit, right? I think there's pros and cons, and I'm not going to go over everything, right? External tables, like you saw in the initial demo, it's basic authentication, right? I can't do Windows authentication yet, right? Distributed transactions aren't supported, but in link servers they are supported. So there's pros and cons here, and at this point you got to go, okay, what are my requirements? What do I really need, and what am I going to use? Okay. I kind of show you. All right. So here's a quick difference. I just wanted to highlight the differences here between external tables and link servers, right? Again, I think there's pros and cons to both, right? But what I do want to do before I get into the demo is talk about push down computations, right? And I mentioned this earlier. We really got into, when Dan and I got into this, it was okay. SQL link servers must be slow because it basically says, hey, if I select something from a table and join, it brings all that table, all that data back, and then then does all the computations on from where I'm executing the query, right? Well, we found that's different in SQL Server 2019, but one of the great things about PolyBase, because this is a PolyBase presentation, is that it actually does the push down. So if I, all my aggregations, all my computations, it pushes those down to the source and will only return the results to me. So it should be much faster, right? It should be much faster, right? And the whole goal around that is to reduce the workload on the your SQL Server instance, right? So I don't want to have to bring all that data back and then do all the computations. That's an extra workload on that, on the source, where I'm on my SQL Server. But I want all the work to happen where the data resides, because that drastically improves performance. If I can have all those computations done where the data resides, improve performance, right? So I included the link here on the slide to the computation. There are, there's a ton of things that are functions that are supported in SQL Server, string and mathematical functions that are supported automatically, that are automatically pushed down. Some are not supported, like, greatest, rand, checksum. It's all in this document, right? What that means is that those will not be pushed down. Those will have to be done on the calling side, right? So those are not supported. Those are not available for push down, okay? And there's a whole slew, like, and I think the key takeaway from this slide is that, without, and one of the great things about this is that, you can do facilitate push downs of the join operator, which is awesome, right? So if I have a join operator, it'll push that down as well and do all the computation on where the data resides and then bring that back. Without that join push down, the data from the tables are brought back into TempDB and then joined, right? So now you have this overhead on your SQL Server instance, okay? All right. So enough about that. Let's get into the demos. And I'm going to come back and talk about stat streams in a minute, right? So let's do this demo. So, all right. So I'm not going to execute this. I'm going to clear my cache, okay? And what I want to do is first query. So I've got these two. I've got my users and badges external tables over here. So on my Stack Overflow 2010. I've got my users and badges tables, and I've got an external table to those here, right? And what I want to do is execute one. This top query returns, I need to include the Excel execution plan, make sure that's turned on, right? So this top one uses a link server, and this top one uses PolyBase, and right? And when we, Dan can back me up here, when we ran this, we were shocked, right? So let's execute these side by side, and let's look at the execution plan, right? So we're going to execute this. Bring this up. Okay. All right. So at return, now let's look at the, so they both brought back the same amount of data, right? Let's look at the execution plan, right? All right. So if we look at this, right, there's a doubt, there's, you know, there's the not that different, right? But if we look at this, it's really, the reason we would do this is, you know, this, we don't know really, you know, the link server was, it's really a black box, right? But this was, you know, 25% query cost. This was 75% query cost, right? But this one actually came back much faster. And when we looked at the XML, then I think this is where we looked at it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep.
Statistics, right? Statistics, right? Yeah, it actually had, which shocked us, right? It actually had statistics on that column, which in previous versions you wouldn't have got, right? Shocked us. Okay, so go ahead, Dan.
No, that, just so you're aware, that statistic you found was only in the PolyBase side. What we're actually seeing here is, yeah, that was in the PolyBase side.
Oh, did I do that? Hold on.
But,
oh, sorry, wrong one.
But what we're seeing, but what we do see here is that the all of the push down does happen on the link server side. So it's actually pushing everything down, and somehow, and again, this is what's odd, is there are no statistics that are coming back that show, in if you were to just run the top query, there's no statistics in there, but SQL gets the accurate histogram. So somehow SQL Server, and I really thought it was still doing it, but we are. It seems like in 2019, at least that's when we're doing our test here, and it's querying against a 2022. So your mileage may vary because I haven't had time to build everything else up. SQL Server is getting all of the statistics based on what the query is for a link server. So that's what really kind of shocked us. The second query, though, using the PolyBase, two things of note. When doing joins, for some reason, SQL Server, when going across PolyBase, doesn't understand order. And right, so yes, you're going to see a sort operator on a lot of those. So if you're needing non-sorted data, that can be fine, but do be aware for like merge joins, you're going to be running into some potential issues, and it'll throw a sort operator in there. But we did see also then the PolyBase that we'll get to later it does use the statistics that we've created locally for the external sources. So yeah, it's just interesting. So again, if you are saying, hey, I want to completely refactor, I want to get rid of link servers, I was pleasantly surprised that a lot of the performance is working. So again, our server here is getting an accurate statistical representation histogram on the remote query, which I don't remember reading that in any Microsoft notes for what's going on. But at that point, I'm like pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It, like I said, it shocked us. Dan and I were like, what the heck? And we spent a lot of time. So, you know, again, your mileage may vary if you're doing this on, you know, an older version, right? 2016. We don't know, you know, we haven't tested that. This was just on 2019, querying at 2022. But it shocked us that the link server query understood the stats, right? 100% understood them, right? So we expected the opposite, right? And so even, you know, we even see excessive grant on, you know, warning on this one, right? But that's, you know, neither here nor there. So we wanted to point this out. I wanted to point this out because, we, like I said earlier, we went in here trying to figure out, prove one thing, and at least on 2019, 2022, it was the complete opposite, right? Now, and we'll actually come back to that, right? So hopefully this makes sense. Now, I want to keep going because one of the things that I want to take next is say, well, okay, I've got, how does it know about statistics, right? So what I'm going to do is I've got a very simple example here. I'm going to query the user external. Now, is link servers, is PolyBase bad? Can you get in performance improvement over that? Absolutely. And this is what this demo is going to show here, right? So I want to make sure that this statistics is dropped. I don't think, yep, it's dropped. All right, so I'm going to query just a select ID from this external table, where reputation equals 1, right? And so I want to query that. Okay, that'll take a little bit of time. Oh, is my my execution plan. So if we look at the remote query, so notice here I've got the actual number of rows for all executions, 40,713, but the estimated number of rows for execution is 547, right? Significant difference, okay? This is because the local external table doesn't understand the statistics of what's on the, what's over here on this side, right? So what we're going to do is let's create the statistics with full scan, right? So and what a full scan means, basically it's going to reach into that database over here in my 2022 instance, look at all the data and say, all right, and bring back the statistics. It's going to basically do a full scan on that table. Here's how many rows you got, bring back the statistics, right?
Yeah.
So,
and a couple things just to be aware of. The reason we are doing a full scan, and you're like, well, that's a lot to be working on. PolyBase only allows for with full scan or with sample percent, and you have to enter the percent that you're doing. It doesn't just do a default sample size. So that's why we put it there.
Yep. So if I actually take that out and try to run this, it'll error. Right. Oh, it
already exists.
Let's try. Let's drop it and try again. All right. So yeah. I think when we do this, it's going to error. Yeah. Gotta do full scan. Right. So let's run this again. Create the statistics. And then we're going to execute this same statement again, and then let's look at the difference, right? All right. Same thing, remote query, but notice now the values. Actual number of rows for all executions. It now knows the local table, the external table here locally, now understands what's over there on my SQL Server 2022 instance, right? I've got actual number of rows, 40,713. Estimated 40,723, right? Super close. So drastic difference between 500 something and 40,000, right? It now knows. So when I actually queries, I'm actually going to get a better execution plan because my stats are up to date, right? Okay. But this led us to we've got 12 minutes left, so I'm going to make this really quick. This led us to, well, hey, if I've got a PolyBase and I've got these external tables, how do I keep my stats up to date all the time? Right? And there's several ways we can do this, right? And one of the things we started playing with a lot, and Dan, kudos to Dan for doing this. He actually brought this out, right? He wrote this code to say, hey, go get, let's do this, right? And you can do this, show statistics, and you can pass this with stat streams parameter, right? And get the stats. So if we were actually to execute this, right? So I'm going to execute that. Yep. Actually, I'm going to do this on this side, right? Because what I want is the stats. Sorry, I want the stats of this table. So hey, for example, we're going to query the users table, right? And so I'm going to go to the users table. I'm going to go to statistics. I'm going to grab. And you can see we've been testing, right? But this is the actual initial statistics. So I'm going to grab that, put that here. Here's the column I want the stats on. And here's the table that I'm going to now put the stats on my SQL Server 2019 instance, right? So if I run this, cannot find
wrong database.
Oh, you're right. Thank you. This is why you're on the call, Dan. There you go. So there's my stats. So if I go over here and copy this out, and I'm just going to go back over to my source, create a new window. Oh, I didn't want that. I'm going to create a new window, paste that here. This is the stats, right? This is what do I want to call it?
It's an 8 kilobyte page var binary format that's proprietary to Microsoft. They, tweak it all out, but this is exactly how you would build a histogram. A few things of caveat is that this piece of data right here is legitimately copying and pasting the actual histogram. If you were to go to a statistic on your Object Explorer and script it out, it's not going to do this. It's just going to give you, create statistic on blah, blah, blah. This is all of the histogram in all of its, funness and form. A few things of note is we have found out that 2022 SQL Server copying statistics doesn't go on 2019.
I was just going to get to that. Yeah, so it's interesting. But as Dan found out, you can take 2019 to 2019, 2016. But in this case, if I were to run this here, it would fail. So you can't go from 2022 to 2019. It'll fail, right?
Now, so that means at some point Microsoft did a change to the way the statistic histograms are working. If I can cross my fingers and all of that stuff, I would love if they changed the way that statistical histograms in 2020 in future versions work, such that we can expand the 200.
Oh, we lost Dan. Oh my goodness. Dan, we lost you. I'm going to keep going then because we got 8 minutes and I've got another demo. All right. So let me explain this a little further in the slide. So essentially what we did is we went onto the 2022, got the binary representation of the statistics of that column, brought them over to 2019, and if we can run this, right, then our stats would be up to date on that external. So you're probably asking, well, what is the difference, right? Well, the difference here is that this had to go and reach in across and say, query all the stuff, query that source table, that column, get the stats and bring it back, right? Where this example said, just do it on the source and run it, right? So let me take 1 minute and explain the difference, what the difference would be, right? Stat stream, right? So the stat stream, as you saw, is a binary representation of the statistics data. It basically says, hey, here's the stats, run it on the source, bring it to the destination, right? Can it be useful to fully recreate the statistics again? So it's like, so in this scenario, let's say the users table kept getting added data, right? I want to update statistics. Well, I need those updated statistics on my external table, so I can recreate those on my external table and update statistics on my external table, right? Now, I do want to show you this, right? Because while it works, so if I were to run that on 2019, for example, right? I do want to highlight this, right? Stat stream, not supported, future compatibility is not guaranteed, right? So even though it's there and you can use it, the documentation says, hey, it's not supported. I do want to call that out, but you're free to use it until they remove it from, whatever version, okay? So, all right, very quick. So the reason we're talking about that is because how cool it would be to go, hey, I've got this, I've got in my case, my SQL Server 2022 instance, right? And that's getting, updated. I need to update stats all the time there. Wouldn't it be cool if I could automatically say, hey, I want to now update my stats on my 2019 instance, right? And so running this, so you could either use PowerShell or some source to go, hey, run this, create the stat streams and apply it on my external table, right? Yeah. That way you're. Sorry. Yeah, we lost you, and I kept going.
Yeah, sorry right. about that. Starlink apparently isn't as great. Some satellites must have moved on to me. But so, I just wanted to touch base that the manualness of the script that I sent over to Scott is not its final form. I am working on getting a PowerShell so that you can just say, here's a server and SQL Server that has the tables, and here's the server where I need them to be applied, and it does it. I'm currently working on an environment where we scale horizontally. And so we have one source database, and we have right now 9 servers that are currently using link servers to copy over to it, and or we're using replication to bring the data over. And this allows us to say, hey, we'll just update stats on the source end, and we'll just copy and apply them all out. And so that way that works out for us.
Yeah, I got 5 minutes, so I'm going to keep going. Sorry to cut you off, Dan. And I was just actually getting into that, like how cool it would be to go, hey, I've got all these stats up, on my 2022 instance, automatically apply those on my 2019 instance, right? So that's the stat stream. Totally cool, to automate that. And that's what Dan's talking about. All right. So again, I got 5 minutes. I want to wrap up just with a very cool demo. So when do you use what? It depends. So, it depends on what version of SQL Server you're doing. It depends what you're trying to, what requirements are. So, happy to chat about this in more, but I want to get to the non-relational side, right? And this is a very quick demo, right? I'm going to use PolyBase to query a CSV in Azure Blob Storage, right? And the reason we do this is because, again, in this scenario, the only difference is now I have to create the external file format. Awesome. All right. The reason we want to get to this is because a lot of our clients are like, hey, I've got all this data, I've got this table of terabytes of data. I want to, from a data archival perspective, right? I don't want all this is taking up disk space, but storage in Azure Blob is so much cheaper, but I still want it queryable, right? Great. Let's, from a data archival perspective, let's take some of this data, put it in CSVs in Azure Blob Storage, but still make it queryable. And I can still union those, join those to my local SQL Server tables, right? So I have, just very quick demo, I have a very simple CSV here. My homies, the only difference is that I included one other person, right? So if we look at, where's it at? Edits, for example, I just added one person, Sherry. All right. So what I'm going to do is same thing, right? We walked through this. So I've already got, my scope credential done. So I'm going to basically create an external data source, and it's basically saying, hey, go to this container. Here's my mouse. Go to this container in this Azure storage account. That's my external data source, right? And so I'm going to create that real quick. All right, super fast. Here's my file. Now you have to, like I said earlier, got to create the external file format. And this says, hey, what's the field delimiter? So it's comma separated. If there's any strings, what's the string delimiter? And hey, if you notice in that text file, the data started on row 2. My headings were on the first row. So start the first row, right? So I'm going to create that. Done. I'm now going to create the external table, right? It says, hey, go into this container in Azure Blob Storage and create a table pointed to this CSV, that CSV I pointed out earlier, right? Use this file format and this data source, right? So I'm going to do that. Let me do it this way, much faster. Okay. Done. Select star from, right? So now I have an external table. Refresh. Oh, it's going to be in my, it's going to be in this one. Tables, external tables. There it is, right? So now we just query that, right? Boom, there it is. All right, there's Sherry, right? So same thing, right? So now I could have as many CSVs out there and external tables pointed to that data, and then I could say, hey, join this table to a local table. Anyway, all right. So that was, I'm actually shocked this went the whole hour. All right. So learnings and takeaways. We'll get back. We don't have time. So any questions? Let me do this first. All right. So the next webinar is in November. Phenomenal Randy Knight's going to be talking about migrating SQL Server with minimal downtime on the 29th. All right. Thank you. Any questions? And I apologize for rushing through the end of that, but oh my goodness, this was a lot to talk about. But any questions?
I do find it funny, Scott, how you and I were talking about how we only got like 35, 40 minutes worth of stuff to talk about.
We went the whole lot. Yeah, we were before the webinar going. I don't think we're going to go 40 minutes, 30 minutes.
Yep. There is currently, I haven't checked recently, but as of a year ago, there was one gotcha I know of with PolyBase. So if you're creating a query and you're using an enterprise feature of /good plan, which is in Query Store, to allow you to have your engine handle that. Currently, a forced query hinted plan that uses an external table fails. Unfortunately, it doesn't fail in the way that /good plan will say the query screwed up and stop trying. It just keeps trying to force it. And so those two features don't work together. Yeah. I haven't checked recently if they've got that fixed or even if they're, but I have at least reported it to them and we'll see how well that does or doesn't go. If it at least would report it back to the external or to the /good plan DMV and say, hey, it failed, stop trying, that'd be great. Or if SQL would just know, hey, don't try.
Yeah, I think when I come back to the takeaways is one of the things that I think this is, your mileage may vary, right? We tested on 2019 to 2022, right? We found out that in most cases, if not all cases, link servers were faster, right? But if you're using, older versions of SQL Server, PolyBase may be faster, right? Especially now that you can, go update statistics, right? Through the methods that we've shown. So this is try it, see what's best and works best for you, and I'd be totally interested in what you find out. We haven't had a chance to test on earlier versions yet, so that's just because we haven't had time, but we'll try to figure that out. So Jason, any questions?
Well, there were questions that came in, but Dan has been answering those like a superstar. So I think we're good. Time's up, as you said. For everybody that's still with us, tomorrow I'll be sending the email recapping this webinar with a link to the video and a link to register for that November webinar that's coming up.
Okay, cool. Well, hey, everybody, appreciate everybody's time.
Yep, thanks for being with us.